I'm really excited to introduce Dr. PeterNichol, our Chief Medical Officer. He's a minimally invasive pediatric surgeon at American Family Children's Hospital in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Them's fighting words. Them's fighting words.
Yeah. So anyway, Peter's a great personal friend. He came on very early in the podcast and talked a lot about efficiency. And one thing you don't always hear is surgeons that would actually go down into sterile processing and spend several hours, and he actually put trays together. Well, and then you spent several days after that. So he's taken a great deal of interest in the entire surgical services area, and definitely with sterile processing. So he was a natural fit for our organization, and he's going to make fun of me a little bit in this presentation, and it'll be great to have him. So if we can have a great round of applause for Dr. PeterNichol.
Thank you, Justin. Can you guys hear me okay? I tend to be a mumbler, and when I get excited, I tend to talk really fast. So my wife likes to tell the story about if I was telling the story of Little Red Riding Hood, it'd be really succinct and be there's a wolf in the house dressed like grandma about to eat a small child. The end. I'm not as entertaining as Bob Mars. He was definitely channeling his inner Steve Martin and being a wild and crazy guy. I've been Chief Medical Officer, I think since, was it February 2019 when we were down in Indianapolis? I think that's when all this started. This really all started because I was on vacation. My wife is from California, and we were in Santa Monica on 3rd Street Promenade, and I'm an obsessive email checker even on spring break, which is kind of a no-no when you have an Italian wife. And I got this third of 3 emails. I didn't get the first 2, but the third one from one of my orthopedic surgeons. I'm at a children's hospital, and it was, I'm sorry to complain again, but this is the 3rd time this has happened in 2 weeks, but there's bone fragments on my pants. We had to tear everything down, da-da-da. And then I read the email thread, and, you know, the chief medical officer she was doing this whole culture of safety thing, which I still don't really understand how it works. You just basically talk about safety, and your serious safety events go down. I'm not sure how they measure this or how they measured it before we actually had this program. So she wrote this email saying, well, you know, sterile processing is really complex until we all sort of discuss it and realize how complex it is, or we continue to have these problems. I'm like, this is bull. And then my surgeon chief chimed in, and he made some comment about, well, we're going to devise a plan, and that'll be devised by our chief nursing officer. Madam Chief Nursing Officer, can you please respond? And she said, we're going to convene a committee, and we're going to study this, and da-da-da. And I'm like, look, you guys need to shut down the line. If we were making airplanes, we would stop making airplanes until we figure out what the problem is. The airplanes are crashing, right? And they're like, oh, you can't do that. There's too much money involved. A lot of money involved. And that was what led me to going down into, going into the basement and seeing sterile processing. And quite frankly, 2 things happened. I was appalled and made my head spin. And then I like to blog. I'm not blogging as much as I used to blog. I used to be like an obsessive blogger. I'd blog like once a week. And so, the thing that became very evident was we got way too many instruments in the pants. And if we could just reduce that, then, your error rates will just start going down because your throughput's going down, right? And so I wrote a blog about that, and then these 2 jokers picked it up, and I don't know if they reposted it, but all of a sudden the thing went viral, and I'm getting a phone call from one of those jokers named Justin Poulin saying, hey, would you be interested in doing a podcast? I'm like, sure. So we did this podcast, and I made a comment that really resonated with Justin, which was like, listen, you got to understand something. The way I've used this is people who are actually taking care of the instruments, they're healthcare workers. They're not just technicians, they're healthcare workers. Because the stuff that they're handling and making sure that it is sterile is the thing that's touching the patient. I'm not touching the patients. And then Justin asked me this question about, well, if you can make the whole space more efficient, does the work go away? I'm like, I don't think so. No, it's not going to go away. It's going to change. It has to evolve. It's not going to go away. And then he said, well, would you like to maybe come give a talk at some point? Yeah, sure, whatever. And I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't the end of it. I got a phone call like about 3 months later. Hey, we got you on for this symposium at Stanford. Can you give a talk? I'm like, oh God. So I had to go back and spend more time in sterile processing and actually come up with a talk, and I just write a blog. And one thing led to another, and now I'm here. Okay, so So I came up with this title, and I came up with this title without actually knowing the title is for the conference. And Lindsay wants me to walk by our Beyond Clean sign, so he gives some photo ops here. And what I've been thinking a lot about in the last 6 months is interdisciplinary innovation. Okay, and Bob gave a really good talk, which just listening to it made my head spin. Not him, but what he's talking about with all these stupid IFUs. And there's 100,000, and how is anybody supposed to know all those things and all this information, and how poorly organized it is, and the regulators actually have no idea what they're doing, honestly. So they just come up with more regulations, but they're not actually measuring outcomes here. So where's Lindsay? She wanted a picture. Okay, you got a picture of this? You're good. Okay. So interdisciplinary care. All right. So disclosures. Okay. So Chief Medical Officer for Beyond Clean, consultant for Beyond Clean, and I'm going to be talking about attributes and the culture of two companies, B. Braun and its subsidiary Aesculap, which is where I kind of got this idea. Okay. So I'm not going to talk about their products. I'm going to talk about what I've learned by consulting for them. Sorry, wrong way. Still learning here. I'm not a high-tech guy. Okay, so some objective truths about U.S. healthcare. First of all, it is approaching now 20% of the GDP. Second, we're spending almost $4 trillion a year in this space that we can actually measure, okay? It employs 16 million people. It's 11% of all jobs in the United States, and is projected to account for, 18% of all jobs by 2026, okay? Now, inconveniently, we're going to be expecting in the next 10 years shortages of nurses, surgical technicians, dental hygienists, sterile processing technicians, medical assistants that are all critical to the function of U.S. healthcare. There was already an article on this called the Silver Tsunami around nursing, on NPR. So demand for these positions is going to grow by 15% in the next 6 years, and is unlikely to be met. Okay. In the meantime, in all these spaces, people are being overworked. My own hospital, they're getting killed. Okay. They're poorly organized spaces, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how they should be organized based on manufacturing standards in a little bit. But right now, they're poorly organized. Turnover is high. In my hospital, they decided about the bean counters got going about 3-4 years ago, and there was some sort of deficit, and so they're going to flex everybody, and so they started squeezing the poor nurses, and now I got 25% turnover in my nursing staff. I have 60 unfilled FTEs for medical assistants right now in just 2 of my hospitals. The cost of replacing them at $45,000 a pop, which is usually what it costs to replace them, is $2.7 million. So I'd love to see the ROI on squeezing people by flexing them for their hours. Locums, travelers are being used to cover gaps. This costs usually twice what you're paying in salaries, and they're there for maybe 10 to 12 weeks. And experienced people are leaving early, they're taking early retirements. They're going and taking better jobs, they get treated better. They might get paid the same or less, but they're getting treated better. So, we're bleeding people left and right. Knowledge deficits are created when you have a nurse or a healthcare provider who has 20 years of experience and deep institutional knowledge. When they disappear, usually there is no system to transmit that information to other people within the group. And sometimes those people actually don't have the attributes they need to have that deep knowledge. So you lose that knowledge permanently when that occurs. And whether they know it or not, hospitals are losing money because of this. Okay, locums, overtime, sick call, replacing employees, and ultimately you end up turning away patients. This is what's happened with our staffing matrices down at UW. They brought in PRISM. PRISM says, here's how you do it, and now patients can't get seen. Great solutions there. So there is a critical convergence that's occurring. Baby boomers are aging and needing more health care. We are certainly doing more complex surgeries on more complex patients, in part because they're aging, they're living longer, and we're getting more daring with surgery. There are shortages in healthcare workers. They're taking early retirements. And hospitals basically are failing to grasp the complexities of medical economics. Okay? I was down Northwestern for a leadership conference for the Society of University Surgeons back in September, and every single instructor that I had got up and said the most complex business model that's ever been created is an academic medical center. Nobody really understands how it works, and the people who run it really don't understand how it works at all. So healthcare really is now teetering on the brink of collapse in the next 10 years because we're not going to have the workers to do the work. Big problem. So this is happening now. In my own state, there are regions where we have no EMTs, no EMS services. You call 911, nobody comes. And this is the regions of the state where people go and take vacations. all right? You go to the ED, you sit in the hallway, you're not seen, and eventually you go home because there's nobody there to see you, okay? Or the queues are so long, you just give up. There are no beds in the hospital. This is going to become a big problem for us in this country and every other country if the coronavirus hits, okay? There's no providers to take care of you. This is a problem as well. So there are rural parts of my state, Wisconsin, where there are no healthcare providers. They got to drive 30, 40 miles to see somebody. So if somebody gets sick, they don't even have EMS there to pop an IV in or stick in a breathing tube. And we don't have any staff to staff our OR. I mean, we just finally got back up to full staffing in the last 2 weeks. This has been going on for months, okay? So some of this is our own doing. You know, in Wisconsin, our legislatures in their infinite wisdom passed Act 10, which completely gutted the unions. And that really changed things. And you can see an uptick in our nursing shortages because of this. I will tell you also, being on both sides of this, the unions did themselves no favors solely focusing on jobs. They needed to have a more progressive attitude about this, for lack of a better word, knowing that certain jobs are going to be eliminated. How do you rise to meet the other needs that are out there? And how do you do this while focusing on patient outcomes? Because that's the most important thing that you can do. And safety was a lot better when we had unions that were empowered in the state of Wisconsin. Patient safety was. We've chronically underfunded Medicare, Medicaid. Medi-Cal pays like 10 cents on the dollar in California, right? And this cuts reimbursements to hospitals, so they have less infrastructure and less money to pay people. And we have, in this country, how having spent time in Europe and seeing how workers function in Europe and the philosophy they have around workers in Europe, we fail to recognize and optimize the value of our skilled workers in this country. This is an epidemic across this country. So we fail to recognize that a healthcare system which we've built has fundamental limitations in its current state, generates $1 trillion of waste every year. And if you were to take all the hospitals in this country and consider them a country themselves, they would be the 7th largest carbon footprint in the world, just the hospitals in this country, okay? And Bob's numbers are wrong. His numbers are from To Err is Human by Lucian Leap, who I used to know. He's an old pediatric surgeon, died a few years ago. That was a report from 1999. There's actually about 440,000 deaths a year because of medical errors. It's the 3rd leading cause of death in this country. So what is our response to all this? Well, you know, my hospital wants to go hire more people, okay? But as Bob pointed out, there's a lot of tasks that are menial. They're high risk, zero reward, and they're almost impossible to do with precision if you're a human being. But we take the Soviet approach, just throw more workers at it. Don't train them, just throw more people at it, you'll fix the problem. Then you got the hospitals freaking out going, no, we gotta save money, gotta worry about our quarterly bottom line, even though we don't have a quarterly bottom line because we're actually a not-for-profit with an authority board, but somehow we seem to think this is important. So let's go flex everybody, let's cut our resources, so reduce our short-term expenses. And then you got, like CMS. Let's add more metrics that we really don't know what they mean, but they're going to burden everybody. The bureaucratic approach things. None of these things work, okay? So, bottom line is you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. You cannot polish a turd, okay? And you can't automate a fundamentally error-prone, inefficient process and expect a better, more efficient result. If the core process itself is flawed, you can't make that better, right? And one of the biggest problems in our system is human error. It's not because people aren't well-intended. It's not because they don't care. It's because we are fundamentally error-prone, okay? And one of the best talks I've ever seen was given by a guy named Manfred Mueller. He is the chief aviation officer, safety officer for Lufthansa. In 2005, he gave this talk at a surgical meeting in Europe. And he talked about 2 really striking things. And first of all, he asked everybody in the audience, you got a bunch of Europeans there and all these surgeons from all over the world, and what's the safest airline in the world? Who has the best safety record? And it's not Lufthansa. Everybody's like, oh, Qantas. Qantas never crashes. Everybody starts sounding like the Rain Man, right? Dustin Hoffman. And he says, why? And they're like, oh, they got better equipment, they're it's the best stuff. And he's like, okay, well, who's the most dangerous? And I don't know, it's like Northeast African Air or something, I don't know. Why? Oh, they got terrible equipment. He's like, nope, they both got British Airways mechanics. They both fly A330s. They got the same equipment. They got the same mechanics. That's not it. Culture. Culture is really critical. So he says there's this old joke. You know how an airline pilot's walked into a room? He'll tell you he's the airline pilot, right? He says the reason the Aussies don't crash, is because they got a flat hierarchy. Good day, lass. Good day, mate. They're all on a first name basis. There's no hierarchy, so there's no obstacles to the flow of information throughout the whole plane. So they know what's going on. They got eyes everywhere. So culture is really important. All right. But the other thing you talked about is human error. And they box the pilots at Lufthansa every 3 months, and they've marched all this stuff out. And you give a person a simple task, and you have them repeat it over and over. They'll make a mistake every 5 minutes or so. You give them a complex task, and have them repeat it over and over. They make a mistake every 90 seconds. You give them a complex task, and you add some stress, and they make a mistake every 30 seconds. So Manfred Mueller says that's why when you see a soccer player run up the field, make a series of moves, blow by everybody, he shoots the ball, he misses almost 99% of the time because 30 seconds have gone by. So there's a lot of tasks that go on in sterile processing and in hospitals in general, okay? And a lot of them are complex, and a lot of them are under stress. So if you take, one of the shifts in RSPD where you got 27 people and you assume they're doing tasks continuously, and half the tasks are simple and half are complex, and of the complex ones, half are under stress and half are not under stress, and you calculate in those error rates for simple, complex, and complex tasks under stress, they're going to make about 10,000 errors in a shift. Now, we handle about 200 pans a shift, so that means you're making 49, 50 errors per pan. Now, they're not all bad, they're not all non-recoverable errors, okay? But still, that's kind of staggering. If you look at our hospital, we got 300 people per shift in an 8-hour shift, and you assume the same 50, 25, 25 split. It's 110,000 errors per shift. It's 120 million errors per year. So if you're doing 12,000 admissions per year, that's 10,000 cumulative errors per patient. Now, they're not all significant. A lot of them are not significant. But a lot of them are. So is it any wonder that we're actually knocking off 440,000 people a year? It really isn't. Okay? And this is, like I said, the third leading cause of death in the United States. So, Lindsay, do I need to do another photo op over here? Or? Okay. So, but the thing is where there's waste, there's opportunity. There's a hospital that's not too far from here, down in La Crosse, called Gunderson Health. And they have made, it's hands down the best hospital system I have ever been around. So I've been at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, University of Virginia, University of Wisconsin, University of Utah. And then I cover the Aurora system on the east side of the state of Wisconsin. And we also cover Rockford Swedish. And we go to Bellin Health, which is also a very good healthcare system up in Green Bay. Gunderson Lutheran is the best, hands down. They're the only facility that was invited to the Paris climate talks because they're like 98% off the grid for carbon footprint and particulate emissions. But they have a relentless culture around efficiencies and safety. And they realized a long time ago that all the gold in the basement of the hospital is waste. And the more you can mine the waste and get cost avoidance, the more money you make, okay? So waste is opportunity, and waste, there's a lot of it in healthcare. This is a paper from 2019, October, by Schrank et al., and it's a whole lot of Benjamins, and I already told you some of these numbers, $3.82 trillion per year spent on healthcare in direct costs, about $1 trillion of waste, and health plans are paying via value-based models that reward quality measures and outcomes, but it's still not working really well. And in this paper, they talk about the 6 domains of waste. So failure of delivery of care, failure of coordination of care, over-treatment, low-value care, pricing failure, fraud and abuse, and administrative complexity. And like a lot of people, they take the easy path and say the biggest waste here is actually this. It's administrators, right? So administrative complexity is the greatest source of waste in the United States today and can be a result of payers' efforts to reduce waste by reducing over-treatment and low-value care. I'm not sure that's entirely a fair statement, that that's why they're doing it. I think healthcare is actually very complex and very hard to administer, okay? But it didn't, I didn't miss the point that you have this one space down here, administrative complexity, that's trying to address this space here, over-treatment and low-value care. So you're spending more money in one space to try and reduce another space. In the meantime, what about the other 4 domains? You're not addressing those at all in terms of healthcare waste. And, quite honestly, none of this really matters because regardless of where you are in the political spectrum, you're going to have administrators, right? So if it's Donald Trump, you are going to end up with everything being privatized, no Obamacare. You're still going to have, insurers have administrators. And if you end up with Bernie Sanders, who wants to have a nationalized healthcare system, you need people to administer that too. And the bottom line is the people who administer that really don't understand how to integrate coordinated care and structure it to reduce waste. Okay? And I'm not saying they're bad people. They just don't know how to do it. So let me give you a little bit different perspective on waste and cost in the United States healthcare, and then I'll talk a little bit about sterile processing and how much waste goes on there. So if you look at like diabetes or Alzheimer's is about $277 billion a year we spend on that. If 25% of that's waste, that's $70 billion of waste. Diabetes is $314 billion a year, $79 billion, $80 billion of waste. And if you're not going to really cure these diseases, these costs are going to be there constantly unless you go and fix the system, right? And if you want to cure these diseases, I mean, in a high-tech way, then you have to have genetics, genomics, epigenetics, personalized medicine, intelligent EMR, and computational capacities that we currently lack today to really address these issues, to have any hope of curing these diseases. Or, you could do this, make me an Iron Man, give me that glove from, what was the final movie, Endgame, with the stones on it, I snap my fingers, right? Say, I am Iron Man, and I change the food chain. I put everybody down to 1.5 meals a day, and a la Justin Poulin, they all start fasting for 16 hours between meals, and this whole problem goes away in 10 years. And I'm not kidding about that, okay? But guess what? And that ain't going to happen in this political climate. Nobody's going to allow that to happen. Part of the reason is the business models don't support it, okay? So we make, well, not we in this room, but companies make a lot of money commoditizing food. The top nutrition companies in the world, Nestle, Abbott, are right now in nutrition to a race to the bottom to sell the cheapest calorie. The cheapest calorie is sugar. Okay, so they're selling. They sell absolute garbage in terms of medical nutrition right now. They're not alone. Okay, we're all commoditizing food. Now, we here, but in this country, we do things with food that they would never do in Europe. Okay. But the market for that is much, and drive for that is much greater than the benefit, the value we see as a society, because we can't monetize it of everyone being healthier. We don't have that kind of mindset. So the business models don't support this. So I'm not going to try and fix these two diseases, or at least one of these diseases. So let's talk about problems we can fix. Viable waste cost opportunities that will, where business models support reducing cost, waste, and simultaneously improving health and healthcare. So sterile processing, the current state in the United States, it's a mess, as Bob pointed out. It's littered with waste. It's contributing to rising costs of labor, supplies, delays, and errors. The question is, how much waste? So I did a business analysis. This is what really got me launched with my own hospital. And now I'm a dyad partner with our head of the VP of supply chain, and we're making some pretty significant changes to how we're doing sterile processing. But there were three major domains of waste here as well. So this is business analysis, sorry. And I did this we have a 9-facility healthcare system. I only looked at 2 hospitals that are next to each other that have fairly high complex care. So the Children's Hospital, American Family Children's Hospital, and University Hospital. Okay, and they're connected by a bridge and they share SPD. So about 19,000 to 21,000 cases per year, depending on the year. That number's going up every year. We do about 600 PANs a day. So 194 elective OR days a year, so I'm not including the traumas and stuff comes in on weekends and whatnot. So, somewhere north of 60,000 instruments processed per day. We went through pan reduction. We're still using only about 22% of the instruments on the pans, a year and a half after pan reduction. And that's because of a lack of informatics to drive that and to continuously drive that. It costs about 77 cents to reprocess a single instrument. So there's lots of potential waste here. So how much waste? Well, those 3 domains, just HR turnover, overtime travelers, okay? We're short 10 FTEs at least. We are hiring locums, travelers to fill in the gaps, to build the pans. And then you got to replace these workers, and you got to pay overtime. And I'm not including sick call in here, but that's somewhere between $1.4 and $1.9 million. So guess what? We went to our COO and said, look, this is the cost of you doing business. You're losing this money anyways. Give it to us, and we'll reconfigure how we do this. So now we're about a month away from a major salary bump, which I think is going to probably have fairly cataclysmic effects in the region. We're going to start people off at $20, $21 an hour. And there's going to be 4 levels, $20, $24, $28, $32 an hour. And it's going to be up or out. I mean, there's going to be an educational program and performance metrics and all this other stuff. But right now, the average salary is $19 an hour. So this is a significant improvement over where we were, and we're pairing with the technical college to develop an education program, a one-year education program, post-secondary education program for them. We also lose a ton of money re-sterilizing unused instruments, almost $7 million a year. And then, so these are real hard costs, right? I mean, these are really hard costs you can calculate pretty accurately. Then there's the soft costs of delays. And we get about one instrument delay per OR per day, usually 8 to 10 minutes, and it's $143 a weighted average per OR minute. We looked in the literature, and the literature supports that rate of delays from instruments. So our total that we're losing just in these three areas is about $19 million in hard costs and capacities every single year. And this is just the price of doing business, right? So if you were to make this clinical work up, and we have, a 3.8% operating margin, which is very healthy for any hospital. There's a lot of them, you go down to the Carolinas, it's like 1/2%. In fact, our new president came from a South Carolina hospital, and he's like, I don't know why you guys have all this redundancy. We just would do it on a shoestring budget. We have a 40% collection rate, and we're in a market where 70% of people are insured. So we're not in Fresno, California, where it's 25% are insured and 75% are on Medi-Cal, or in Texas, where it's 80% are on Medicaid and 20% are insured in El Paso. But in that healthy market with fixed costs, we'd need to raise about $225 million a year in net revenue to pay for this waste. And that means we'd have to increase our charges to over $500 million. Now, when you think about the infrastructure you have to lay out to increase your charges, $500 million, it's staggering. So the price of doing business here is really just no longer acceptable. And this is in a robust healthcare market. So this is really kind of the tip of a much larger iceberg, because if you march out our numbers as a system and you look at the total number at $994 a case of what we're losing in waste right now related to instruments and sterile processing, and you multiply that by the total number of surgical cases that are performed in ORs in the United States, which is 51 million, you end up with a $50 billion problem a year. Okay, now that's right now that 5% of all the healthcare waste of the $1 trillion, right? But what I am excluding from this, because I got another staggering number, is we spend another $23 million in repairing devices and medical equipment a year. I couldn't believe that number. So if you add that in, now you're talking about a $100 billion problem, and I'm not including the medical legal issues, the risk with shutting down a hospital like Seattle or Detroit Medical Center, which happened because of sterile processing, or the outpatient surgery center in Saddlebrook, New Jersey, where they exposed 3,700 people to HIV and Hep C. And I'm not including the 3 to 6% of instruments that get lost every year. So this is a very big number. It's probably between 5 and 10% of all healthcare waste. Go back to Alzheimer's, where it's $70 billion, right? So this is a problem we can actually fix, and we need to fix. So it's a big iceberg. All right, guess what else is getting impacted here? There was this great paper by Christine Thiel looking at carbon footprints from ORs. All right? So you can so this is just looking at hysterectomies, and then marching out those numbers for all 600,000 hysterectomies that are performed in the United States per year, laparoscopic hysterectomies. 46% of the carbon footprint is because of unused instruments. 9% is because you have single-use instruments that you don't reprocess. So it's over half the carbon footprint of a laparoscopic OR. So 72 kilotons of carbon dioxide just from these 600,000 hysterectomies. If you look at all laparoscopic surgeries, now you're talking about 18,000 kilotons of carbon dioxide. And 8,000 of those kilotons are from unused instruments. So there's also an environmental imperative here that we're talking about in this business plan or business model. So this all seems like a good opportunity, certainly SPD, but there's also a number of other opportunities out there. And like I said, where you have the greatest opportunities where there is the greatest waste. And it is in designing business models that will simultaneously reduce your waste and human error while improving your accuracy, efficiency of healthcare delivery, your outcomes. So let's talk about who can solve these problems. So who saw Ford versus Ferrari? So not a lot of race car people here. This is actually a great movie, all right? And they talk about a lot of themes in this movie, but one thing they don't talk about is the shade tree American genius, okay? And so what is that? What is the shade tree American genius? Well, my first experience with this is when I was at the University of Virginia doing my first 2 years of residency. I had this great neighbor, Paul Leroy, and he told me this story that he'd heard where I think it's called Martha Washington, is the private hospital in Charlottesville, Virginia. And they had purchased some sort of massive industrial air conditioning unit or something, or some kind of massive piece of machinery they had to put in their basement. And they had bay doors, and they got in the basement, but it actually had to sit down into an area that was depressed down by 2 feet, into a bed. Okay, so they get this thing, they roll it in there, and now they're stuck. They have this multi-ton device, and they can't get it down into the bay where it needs to be. And so they get some engineers and all sorts of stuff, and everybody's sitting on the scratching their heads. And one of the maintenance guys comes walking by, he's like, if you give me $1,000, I can get that in there for you. I know, come on, right. And no, it's just, I can do this. So I'll need a couple days, I got to get some equipment, but I can get it in there for you. And they're like, okay, fine. So they gave him the money, and he went and got a bunch of ice blocks. So he put ice blocks in the bay, got some water pumps and hoses, and pushed this machine out on the ice blocks and pumped out the water and sank right down. Okay, that's a shade tree genius. Okay, so they may have no formal education or clear pathway to a high-impact successful profession, but they have an intuitive understanding of how things work and a unique ability to solve problems in novel ways that are rarely recognized. Okay, so this is a shade tree genius, Carroll Shelby. So this guy, no formal education, okay, came out of Texas. He was a chicken farmer, loved to race cars. He was a shade tree mechanic for sure, and he built a race team out of West Coast hot rodders. And this is at the time when Ford had the whiz kids, including Robert McNamara, right? Which really weren't the whiz kids. They weren't that smart. And Carroll Shelby built race cars better than anyone else in this era, including Ferrari, Ford, and Chevy with, what's his name, Zora Duntov, who made the Corvettes. And his team innovated around aerodynamics, motors, design, and brakes, okay? And he succeeded, and this is really one of the tragedies of Ford versus Ferrari, is that he succeeded and he got crushed by Ford in the end of all this. But the reason he succeeded was he had great entrepreneurial skills on top of being a shade tree genius. So he talked his way into racing chassis from AC, and he got a bunch of motors from Lee Iacocca, and he started racing the SCCA with the Shelby Cobras. And he was able to make this happen because as one of his top racers, Dan Gurney, one of the greatest U.S. drivers of all time, said, he had a loose relationship with the truth. And in the movie at one point, and this did happen, is he would sell the same car to multiple people on the same day. So yeah, sell them the car, but don't let them take the car. I got to sell it again in 3 hours. So he was very entrepreneurial, and he also had a deep understanding of racing because he had raced at Le Mans. He had won with Aston Martin in 1959 and beaten Ferrari, and he had to stop because he had an arrhythmia. He actually had angina, was popping nitroglycerin pills while he was driving in that race. And he ran a flat hierarchy. It was Shell, it was Carroll. It was like the Aussies. They were all buddies. They're all hot rodders from the West Coast. And he surrounded himself with very bright people, and they took risks. And he continuously innovated, evolved, and sought input from these people. So he was racing on the SCCA with the Cobras, and they were killing it, okay? But then they go to long tracks in Europe, and they can't win because the aerodynamics in the Cobra don't work. So you had this young engineer named Peter Brock, who's on the left here next to Bob Bondurant, who's one of his drivers. And Pete Brock was 22 years old. He's an engineer. And Shelby had heard that there were some drawings that Porsche had come up with before the war that the Allies had gotten a hold of and he stashed in the GM library. So he sends Pete Brock up there. He doesn't speak German, but he could read, an engineering diagram. And Pete Brock comes back to him and says, listen, I can build your car that's aerodynamic. It's going to look really funny. It's not going to look like anything else you guys have ever seen. And Shelby's, flat hierarchy, took risks, said, Pete, go do it. So Pete's in there, and he basically takes a Cobra chassis, and he totally reskins it, and which is no small task, and it was all with aluminum, which is really no small task. And he comes up with this design. And meanwhile, everybody in the shop, including Phil Remington, who I'm going to talk about momentarily, is making fun of him. And this is the ugliest thing I've ever seen, and this is never going to run well. They go on the track, and they're out at Riverside, California, and the car runs like 10 miles an hour faster and 7 or 8 seconds faster on the lap than the Cobras. They take that car in 1964. They almost win the Manufacturers Series. In 65, they had 5 of these cars, and one of them led Le Mans overall for like 6 hours, and they won the Manufacturers Series that year. The only American manufacturers who ever do this. And then, of course, Ford promptly killed the program and he had to get rid of all these cars because it's what big industry tends to do in this country. So this was his supporting people, supporting risk, and his flat hierarchy at work. Another great guy, if you see the movie, is Phil Remington. Phil Remington was another genius. So they had this big problem after they won the Manufacturer Series and they won Le Mans the following year, is that two things happened. One, Ferrari came back with a much better program in '67. In the first endurance race of the year, which is Daytona, it's 24 hours, Ferrari takes first, second, and third, blows them off the track. The year after, Ford, with the GT40 program, and Carroll Shelby won Le Mans. So then the other thing that happened was that his top driver, not Phil Hill, what's his name? Ken Miles, gets killed testing out Riverside with a car that's faster but aerodynamically unstable. So Phil Remington takes that car that was unstable and takes it to the Dearborn Wind Tunnel at the Ford headquarters, and in the next 2 weeks completely reskins it. It's an aluminum monocoque chassis, which is not easy to do again, and they end up racing at Sebring and winning Sebring and then winning Le Mans that year. Those are the kind of geniuses that he surrounded himself with. And he did not have a hierarchy. It was all flat. So usually this approach fails, however. Being an innovator, running a startup, which is what he did, fails 98, 99% of the time, often in spectacular fashion, particularly if you have a loose relationship with the truth. So we don't really do a good job of harvesting this talent in this country. This is really what this talk is about. Interdisciplinary innovation and flattening out the hierarchy. We also do a terrible job improving healthcare. 440,000 deaths a year, $1 trillion of waste, leading cause of bankruptcy, actually, in this country. You want to put a family over the edge, give them a hospital bill. Problem is, healthcare is like a pre-Adam Smith pin factory. Do you guys know who Adam Smith was? He wrote The Wealth of Nations, and which was a book really about capitalism, but it was not in a bad context. If you take a human being and you have them make a pin, you put a bunch of human beings together in a factory and all making their own pin, it's actually a very slow process. They don't make a lot of pins. But you have them specialized, right? They used to one step of the pin, you can make many more pins. That was the thesis of his book, Wealth of Nations. Well, capitalism and the way they use it in Europe is they use it to leverage it to make technology better. So, for example, the amount of time and energy we spend on generating light now, because we have electric grids and we have LED lights, is minimal. The cost of generating light is minimal. It's like 1/1,000,000th of what it was 2,000 years ago. Okay, and everybody benefits from that, right? And light bulbs are safe. LED lights are safe. You're not exploding. You don't have to create a fire, right? So we have not leveraged technology in healthcare in this way. We use it in different ways. We use it to make money. And the reason I know this is, one of the manufacturers, who will rename nameless, who's not too far away from here, makes surgical staplers. Every 2 years, jacks up the price of their surgical staplers. Every year, every other year. There are laparoscopic ports that are disposable, cost $350 made out of plastic. And there's no negotiating with these companies, at least in this country. They use technology market to compete, but they don't really use it to improve efficiencies, reduce waste, and reduce errors. We did a study within our own group with pediatric surgeons and found that there's no benefit to using surgical staplers and appendectomies. Increase your costs, doesn't improve your outcomes. It doesn't reduce your length of time in the OR either. So we don't use technology in that way, and we need to start using technology in that way. So how do we do that? And where do the insights for that come from? Because, like I said, healthcare is a very complex financial beast. It's a really complex entity, right? And who is going to come up with those insights? Man, this clicker really is slow. So I would argue that it's these guys and all of you that are in the trenches that are trapped within this vertical hierarchy of American healthcare. And what I mean by trapped within the vertical hierarchy, well, in my system is people are afraid to speak up because, I don't want to piss off the surgeon because the surgeon's way up here and I'm down here. That has to end if we're going to fix these problems. So, the one approach is the Stanford Biodesign Center. There's a number of think tanks around the world now. A lot of corporations have them. Stanford decided back in 1998 to get into biodesign as opposed to biotech. focused on med tech and instrument design. This is really how it started out. And they launched in 1998. And they have sort of a GE, General Electric conglomerate approach to all this. Like they'll take on any potential problem and throw a bunch of people around it to study it and then come up with a prototype and see if they can market it. They don't actually define themselves by any specific expertise. That model doesn't work long-term really well. And if you want exhibit A of that, look at GE. GE was 25 years ago considered the top company in the world. They got so diversified and lost expertise in just any one single area so badly that they're no longer experts in anything. But they've been successful. They've started 50 companies. Most of those have actually not been successful. 2 of them have gone public. A handful of them have been bought up and incorporated into other companies. So, you know, basically one company every 10 years, 2 out of 50 companies, that's, you know, 4% success rate. That's better than house odds of 1 to 2%, right? It's at least double, if not quadruple the house odds, because 98, 99% of the time you fail. But they have huge budgets and lots of resources. They can build a building like this where they house all this stuff. And they're tied to a major university, which I will tell you slows things down. There's a lot of bureaucracy in universities. And they're not inexpensive to establish. And I think the thing that really bothers me is you have unequal access to opportunities. The way you get into this is you're some high flyer from, you know, some MBA program or, you know, some residency in general surgery or plastic surgery, and you go there and da-da-da. And you're at really, you know, the apex of the education pyramid, right? And so you get a fellowship here and you bring an idea and you develop it. Okay, well, that doesn't work too well, in my opinion, because you leave these guys and everybody else in this room out. So, I want to give you another model for consideration that actually works. It just hasn't been applied directly in hospitals yet. This is Aesculap's headquarters in Tuttlingen, Germany. It's in southwest Bavaria. It's just north of Zurich. It's a town of 38,000 people. They house both, Aesculap is in Tuttlingen and Karl Storz is in Tuttlingen. So this is like having Porsche and Ferrari in the same town in terms of instrument manufacturing. So this is Angela Merkel visiting the Aesculap facilities. That's the COO Jens behind her. So Aesculap is a $2 billion subsidiary of a $9 billion family-owned company called B. Braun. And B. Braun's pretty interesting because they have family-owned, but the person who's in charge owns the majority of shares, so you don't have proxy fights within the family. There's no shareholder fights to slow things down. Okay. They also reinvest 95% of their profits in their company and their employees. They have an average length of employment in their manufacturing floor of 23 years. Okay, and all those people have 2 to 3 years of post-secondary education. They've done an apprenticeship at Aesculap. There is a cooperative relationship with labor unions as opposed to here. Every 2 years they sit down and they say, what are our mutual goals? How do we make sure that we evolve so we stay viable as a business and that there are jobs? And it's not always an easy discussion, but it happens every 2 years. And they've been very successful with this. So they don't have strikes over there. And the workers are extremely well paid, $70,000 a year, free health care, free education, they have a pension, and they get all of August off because that's what they do in Europe. They have very flexible business partnerships. They will buy some companies, they will partner with other companies. They're very loose is not the right word, they're very creative in a good way, flexible in those partnerships. And interestingly, the workers get to patent and keep their ideas. So somebody who was milling on the line and comes up with an idea for a machine that can mill better, guess what? They get to keep that patent. All right? So as a result of that, the last thing I just told you, this is Tuttlingen in the winter. 400 companies have spun off in the last 167 years, all of them independent companies, just from this one company. That's 2.6 companies a year. Crazy, right? So that's a little bit better than the Biodesign Center. This is a town of 38,000 people in southwest Germany, and they're very proud of their small town DNA. Like they're not interested, like they're looking to put a footprint for manufacturing in the United States. They're not interested in going to New York. They're not interested in Boston, and they're not interested in Silicon Valley. They're like, that's not who we are, and that's a lot of money we don't need to spend. So, what can we learn from them? Well, that we can apply in healthcare. What I was told, and I've been told this by several people, But when I was there, we got this beautiful tour, and I said, is there any chance that this is all going to become automated? And the woman who was giving the tour is the wife of one of the senior vice presidents. Her name's Brigitte, and she says, Peter, she's like, do you know how much skill it takes to put together a Castro Viejo? I'm like, no. She says, okay. So she walks me over to this guy who's got these different bins of pieces of Castro Viejos, and he's putting them together, and he's got a Leica microscope in front of him. And he's filing them, he's polishing them. She asks him, how long does it take you to put one of these together? He goes, 2 hours. And how many tasks are involved in that? And he goes, well, I mean, I got to file, I got to polish, I got to inspect, I got to assemble. And she says, and then Brigitte turns to me and she says, you do realize you can teach robots to do stuff, but they can only do one task at a time? If I was going to replace this guy, it would be impossible. It's not cost efficient. The human being is always going to be involved in this. And so what she told me was that, the technology ultimately elevates the role, and the automation elevates the role of the human in all this. It improves the efficiencies, it improves safety, it improves results, it improves the meaning of the work. Now, one of those Castro Viejo vascular needle drivers is worth about $3,000, I think. Crazy, right? The amount of skill that goes into this. And what happens in my hospital? Boom, I got surgeons throwing them around, right? I got people who have no idea because they don't have any empathy, and not that they're empathetic, but they have no empathy feel for what it took for that to be manufactured when they're handling it. They have no idea what they're handling. If it was a Ferrari, do you think they'd handle it that way? No. Okay. So, the bottom line is the people in the trenches are the ones best suited to find new solutions and new business models. This is what you can learn from Asculab. This is how they roll. They also have a world-class innovation group called Work 39, which was established 3 years ago and is like blazing trails now. And this is actually not just Asculab, but B. Braun. And they spent half a year going around looking at all the innovation centers, all the country, all the top businesses in the world, and some of the top universities before they put this together. It's not cheap. They actually bought a used building, a small, modest used building with 3 floors and a basement. They wanted it to be in Tuttlingen, and they wanted it to be a building that was long established. They didn't want to build something new, basically. They want to honor the history of the region and the town. So not cheap, but not Stanford expensive. And they've now brought 4 highly successful products to market in the span of 3 years, which is pretty quick, and they're very mission focused. So let's consider a different approach to healthcare based on what I just told you about Asculab. What if, for interdisciplinary care, we did the following? You pair a leading company and its innovation group with a cutting-edge hospital, okay? And you harvest the ideas of the people in the trenches in the hospital that can tell you where the business opportunities are, the business models that will reduce waste, reduce risk, improve efficiencies, improve care, okay? And focus on opportunities and focus on those and come up with models, prototypes that you can then test, right? So your key ingredients to all this are hospital culture is supportive of its employees and supportive of innovation, okay? So like a Gunderson Lutheran down in La Crosse. They have to have an evolved perspective on hospital industry partnerships. And this is where regulators actually kind of get in the way because of big pharma and because of our attitude about the quarterly bottom line. Hospitals are very suspicious of big industries. And quite honestly, they're getting tired of getting screwed over paying $400 for a surgical stapler and $350 for every single staple load after that. But they have to have an evolved perspective on partnerships with industry. Both organizations have to have interested, mission-driven people. There has to be a willingness to try, fail, and try again. So one thing I learned when I was over in Tuttlingen is, fail early, fail fast, fail cheap, get up and do it again. Because sooner or later you're going to succeed. But you want to know early on in the process if this is going to work or not. You need a mission-driven company partner that's willing to play the long game. So if they're worried about the quarterly bottom line, you could go set up a program like this, and all of a sudden a new CEO comes in, and all the budgets get slashed, and this all goes away. So you don't want to partner with a company that's focused solely on profits. You want to partner with a company that's focused on mission. Transparency is going to be very critical here, particularly around publishing results and who is the one writing the papers, so that you get you don't get just part of the truth out there about the business model or the product you're generating, and there has to be trust. So the way this will work is you identify spaces with the greatest risk for errors and for waste. because these will be your best business models. Convene an idea generator team of healthcare providers for each of these spaces. The idea generator team brainstorms with the innovation center team. Usually you'll end up with, starting out with 150 ideas, you'll distill it down to 2 or 3. You select the ideas that will solve the problems, that ultimately will solve problems not just for your hospital, but for all hospitals, because that becomes a viable business model, right? Innovation center then goes and generates prototypes. The hospital tests the prototypes. If they're linked to a university or they have access to a university, you can test some of the stuff in animal labs, wet labs, right? And ultimately, you run clinical trials with that hospital as a center for those clinical trials, partnering with other health organizations. And then in the end, you have a successful launch of the product. It makes money. The idea generators, the hospitals, the company all share in the success and the profits of this. And the product actually benefits everybody because it reduces waste, improves efficiencies, makes it safer for everybody. One more thing. For this model to work optimally, you really need a flat hierarchy, which I was preaching about not too long ago. And ultimately, you got to start viewing in hospitals every single occupation as a potentially high-tech informatics-driven job. I'll give you a great example. They're already doing this in Silicon Valley with environmental services. Okay, they're using informatics because when you're manufacturing chips, things have got to be, the air quality's got to be superb. There can't be any dust floating around. That's become a high-tech job. Seattle Children's got shut down because of aspergillus and the air ducts over the ORs, right? Well, EVS is really critical to the function of a hospital. We're going to see how critical probably in the next 2 or 3 months with this coronavirus. And yet we pay those people $16 an hour. We don't give them any adequate resources to actually improve their environments. That's crazy, okay? So things you don't need for this model is a major university. You can partner with them, but you don't need them. You don't need a ton of money. You don't need to build a beautiful brand new building like they did for the Biodesign Center. You definitely don't want bureaucracy, and you do not want a vertical hierarchy because that will slow things down. You want people talking to each other, people with great ideas. They can't all be Carol Shelby. They can't all have a loose affiliation with the truth. Some of them are introverts. You want those people coming to the surface with their ideas. So I'm going to just give you a couple examples that came up recently around this, and one had to do with our valets. So we were having a chat. I walk to the hospital because it's 7 doors down from my house, and so I always stop as I come in. I always run the valets, and one's like, "Hey, how can?" He's from Egypt, so he's very emotive. He's a Southern Mediterranean, and I'm Italian, so we get along really well. He's like, "Dude, how come we don't have in the airports?" I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "That thing, QR code." "Yeah, QR code." He's like, "Why don't they send that to the family the night before?" I'm like, "You mean like EMR sends?" They go, "Yeah, have EMR send the QR code. Tell the family where to go." I'm like, so we start chatting, and then I flew down to a meeting in Jacksonville, and I flew United, and when I landed Chicago O'Hare, I get this thing, and I come back and I'm like, "Hey, Amir, what about if we added this?" So you get a map where you land and where you're supposed to be, and of course, it being O'Hare, I got a mile and a half I got to run in 10 minutes to get there. But at least I know where I'm going, right? So why don't you have EMR sending a text the night before with a QR code to the family, plus, you live this far away, typical traffic patterns of this, you should leave at this time. We'll text you a map, Google map, at the time you need to leave with directions. Then they come in, flip out their iPhone, they got the QR code, it gets scanned upon entry by the valet. There's a copay. They can link that to their credit card. And now they get another map telling them where to go in the hospital and whether their physician or healthcare provider is running ahead or behind. Right? They go there, they get done, check out, have the QR code, and their car was valeted. So now the valets know that they're coming, they'll go get the car, et cetera, et cetera. This would help throughput in my clinics where I can't get anybody roomed on time incredibly. And this already exists as a technology, and we're not using it, right? So this is what my valet came up with. The other one, this came from a friend of mine's son who was walking through an ICU, who's got a background in technology. He's an engineer for Google. So he's walking through the ICU with his dad, and he's like, Dad, I don't get this. Why are those nurses punching on that box? Oh, son, that's an IV pump. Well, so what are you doing? Well, they're changing the dose of the medication. Did they get an order for that? Yeah. Well, where does that go? Well, it gets put in the EMR. Well, why isn't the EMR talking to the pump? Why does the nurse have to do that? So, you start thinking about this, and it's like, okay, so, like Kelly Fields, one of my favorite ICU nurses at the Children's Hospital down in Madison. And I talked to her about this, and she's like, I love this. She's like, how many times I'm going to go punch something in an IV pump? I got to go take the order off, walk over the room. It's total chaos in the ICU anyways, because we got like half of them are cardiac patients, right? And they're all on like 5 different pumps. And maybe she's got a headache now because she's up late last night because she's done partying with us or something. And then while she's walking there, and she's a senior nurse, right? And so a more junior nurse, because we had a lot of turnover, comes up to her and says, hey, listen, I'm worried about my cardiac patient. You come do an assessment with me. She goes, yeah, hang on, let me go punch this thing in the IV pump. So now she's totally distracted, right? There's all risk and no reward in that task. What I want Kelly Field doing is I want her going with a nurse to go assess that other patient, because that's her skill set. That's what she's paid to do, right? So why don't we have those kind of technologies? So these are the kind of things I'm talking about. Like you solve this problem for everybody. This goes away now. There are no more medication errors because your EMR, you're going to have error on input in terms of the medications, right? But in terms of the EMR getting it punched into the correct ID, I mean, I got light bulbs in my kitchen my wife bought for $10 a piece at Costco that talk to her Google thing, and it can turn the lights off, turn the lights on, turn them orange, turn them green, turn them blue, turn them purple, turn one green. Why are we not applying these technologies? Picasso said, good artists borrow, great artists steal. We should all be stealing these things and making healthcare better. So this will attack the 6 domains of waste. I mean, when we start doing this across the whole system, you will start compressing that waste down. You're going to be much better delivering care, right? There's going to be fewer drop balls, coordinated care. You think about this in the OR, and being able to use EMR to tell you what your surgical inventory is to coordinate 3 operations for 1 patient with 3 surgeons. Overtreatment, low-value care starts going away. Pricing failure, you can use informatics. Imagine this, like with sterile processing, the number of instruments we send out for repair, and we get over a barrel because it's late. Justin talks about this in his model of preventative maintenance. If you don't do preventative maintenance, it costs you more money. Pricing failure, fraud, abuse, indifference, and negligence. People get more engaged, okay? So a lot of this starts going away, and you don't need as many administrators because things are running smoothly. The technology is continually driving itself to become more and more efficient. It's like light, it becomes much cheaper and safer to manufacture. So with this approach, we can now see an Emerald City, okay? But it is a journey of 1,000 miles that begins with 1 step. And you're going to have a lot of steps in this, and you will fail in many of these steps. And the key is to recover, fail early, fail fast, fail cheap, then take the next step. Make sure that it brings you closer to the summit you're seeking.
All right, everybody. Peter, thank you so much for that information. It was great to see your presentation live in Anoka, Minnesota, and I'm certainly glad that we were able to share it with our viewing audience today. We did get some really great questions that came through. Yeah. I'm going to start with, what change that you have made do you think has made the biggest impact in your sterile processing department?
Educating my leadership, hands down. Like making the business case that they were losing $19 million a year, something like that, in sterile processing between capacities. And so delays, losing OR capacity and time, losing money because of replacing people and high levels of turnover in HR, and they're losing money because they're reprocessing stuff that they weren't using. About 75% of the instruments weren't being used and they're reprocessing them. And once they realized how much money they were losing, that started having an impact on the system, and people started paying attention to it. So now I got their attention, and I can start driving the change I needed to drive. That was the biggest, most important thing I could do.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. This is a great question. You're a surgeon championing sterile processing. How common is that, and how are you getting more surgeons on board with this mission?
It's rare. I would say it's vanishingly rare. The way that I'm trying to get them on board is I'm trying to talk to them about the problem and articulate to them why fixing this problem will make their lives better in the hospital and better for their patients. And interestingly, there's been a lot of enthusiasm in corners I didn't expect because of this. So you've got to become an evangelist. You have to start preaching, and you have to get a bunch of followers.
Wonderful. And we just have a couple minutes left. If you could talk briefly about the sterile processing research that you are doing. I know our viewing audience will be very interested and hopefully will be able to participate.
So currently, we are conducting a survey. Actually, there are 3 surveys to define the current state of sterile processing in the United States and potentially in other countries. So we generated a series of 3 surveys. First one looks at the socioeconomic status and conditions of people working in sterile processing, because you and I both know that they're very much undervalued and they're very much underpaid. Second survey looks at the educational background, because as you know, most countries don't have, including the United States, do not have a post-secondary education pathway for sterile processing. And the third survey looks at safety in the work environment. Those surveys are out there, and you can find them and sign up to take them if you wish at beyondclean.net/research. We also have been contacted by an infectious disease expert out of Norway who is very interested in translating our surveys and surveying the entire population of people working in SPD in Norway. So there's also probably opportunity for people in other countries who want to collaborate to help us with defining the current state of the workforce in sterile processing in multiple countries. The other things that we're working on is we have defined now the number of tasks it takes to reprocess an instrument from the time it is handed to the surgeon in the OR and then leaves the surgeon's hand and then goes through the whole process and gets passed back to the surgeon. We are also collecting data on, and so before I go there are 4 workflows. There's a minimum of 100 tasks in these workflows, and if you watched my presentation, you know, I'm very concerned about high risk, high error events, and we've identified the high risk, high error steps in sterile processing. So that gives us a backbone to start building an education curriculum around, as well as informing you know, technological advances in the process of sterile processing. And then finally, we are looking at surgeon behavior as we're collecting data on the instruments they use to try and reduce their PANs, and then interviewing them to find out if they're comfortable with PAN reduction, which really is the overarching goal. 75% of instruments don't get used. This constitutes 46% of the carbon footprint in the ORs, and it's a huge component of the waste. It's about 40 or 45% of the monetary waste in sterile processing. So that's the other thing we're working on right now.
Wonderful. Thank you for that overview. And if any of you in the listening audience here at the conference today are interested in participating in those surveys, your feedback is anonymous, and it is incredibly important that we get as many responses as possible. You can actually click on the link in the resources box that you see on your viewing screen right now if you'd like to participate. Dr. Nichol, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for a great presentation. And everybody, we will see you in about 15 minutes. Yes, we'll see you in about 15 minutes for Kimberly Prinson's presentation, Perioperative Protocols and Effective Strategies to Reduce OR Complications. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.